Welcome back. Are you hungry? I'm hungry. Let's have some cake. There's a couple of different ways to look at federalism. The traditional one is on the right. It's what's known as a layer cake federalism. As you can see, just is based on the idea of different levels of government, the spheres of authority of the local and state and federal government, and they don't mix too much. Now we're going to start to see historically in the 1970s and thereafter more of what's called a marble cake federalism, and this is how you can see the mixing of the different levels of government and their sovereignty, obviously having to do with some type of grant and mandate from the federal government. In other words, the federal government gives states and localities money saying, hey, as long as you do this, you can have the money. And so therefore they end up sharing in the responsibility of what was formerly a local or a state problem. And here we see Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society with their marble cake type of federalism. This is also known as creative federalism, a creative way for the federal government to exert a little bit more influence into the state and local powers. And so we can see that example of this is Medicaid, which is not to be confused with Medicare. Medicaid is medical insurance, so to speak, for folks that are without, so the poor, the needy, not including the elderly. And the federal government wanted to help those folks out. They did so via grants to the states. So if Lyndon Johnson was famous for creatively giving money and stipulations to the states, President Reagan was famous for wanting to give more generally money to the states and give them more control over it. This is because he is a Republican, famously saying that government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And he was referring, of course, to the national government. So here you have Reagan, who does not believe in the power of a strong central government, but rather the states should have that power. So he starts to give what are called block grants, large sums of money to the states, and he says, I'm not going to tell you exactly how to spend it. I think you can spend it more wisely than me, more efficiently, so just go to it as long as it's in a general area. The trend of devolution continued under the Clinton administration, particularly in 1994 when the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, and they decided to, specifically under Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, to restrict the scope of the government further by transferring even more responsibility to the states, including making laws that had heretofore been the responsibility of the national government. Example of this is the speed limit on interstate highways, and that's how you get states like, I believe it's Idaho, that has crazy 80-mile-per-hour limits. So George W. Bush comes to power, and this is a little bit striking, but whereas the Republicans typically want to reduce the size of government and decrease spending, we see George W. Bush actually doing the opposite. He transfers responsibility more to the federal government for a lot of policy-making decisions, including education, which most Republicans believe is solely a state issue. And he also decides to spend more not by tax increases, which the Democrats would advocate, but by borrowing. And you can understand probably that that can lead us into a little bit of trouble. Now, in his defense, he spent more than he had planned to when he took office because of 9/11 and the wars that followed. But no one can deny that under George W. Bush, a Republican, the government grew more than it had in quite some time under Democrats. Here we can see some of the unintended consequences of No Child Left Behind, one of those federally funded programs. States understand that they could use this money from the federal government for education, but they start to realize that all of the mandates that come with that money aren't so sweet. And in fact, Tom Torlakson, the California Secretary of Education, eventually a couple years ago said, you know, screw it, I don't even want your money, federal government, because we're tired of complying. While this graph is a little bit out of date, it effectively shows the increase in the amount of money that the federal government has given to states over time. Just a drastic increase. And the question is whether or not this trend can continue with the federal government suffering such huge deficits year to year, and now $16 trillion in 2012, debt. The question is, can they continue to give money to the states? And the states are, of course, relying on that as they, too, are suffering financially. So we shall see what happens